Welcome to Central Bank Central. I'm Kathleen Hays. Well, in a week with a parade of central bank meetings, we had a very interesting one from the European Central Bank, for example, holding their policy rate steady. That was widely expected, but giving very little policy guidance. So, how do I even ask my next guest? What have they signaled moving ahead? Meanwhile, very important, very interesting developments now on the war in Ukraine, the trouble across Europe, or certainly the concerns across Europe. And that's exactly why I'm so happy to bring back to Central Bank Central Jacob Funk Kirkegaard. He is a non-resident senior fellow with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He's a resident senior fellow with Bruegel since September of 2024, as a matter of fact. And he was also a resident senior fellow with the German Marshall Fund of the US. And importantly, also in this whole discussion, and particularly when it comes to the war and what's going on now, he worked with the Danish Ministry of Defense, the United Nations in Iraq, and so many more. So, Jacob, great to see you.
Pleasure. Glad to be back.
Yeah, wow. This interesting how this whole the world of policymakers of all kinds seems to be hardly closing. I was saying closing with a bang, but everything just keeps moving forward. But let's start with the ECB, European Central Bank. This is Central Bank Central after all. Christine Lagarde, head of the ECB, unusually cautious it seemed in talking about ECB policy, no policy guidance at all. Does does this mean the ECB doesn't have a policy bias or just afraid to commit to one?
No, I think it means that the ECB just published a new macroeconomic forecast for 26, 27, 28 that shows the European economy growing at between 1.2, 1.4% a year. That's essentially the potential growth. We know that the Eurozone is right now at or very, very close to historically low unemployment rates. We also know that employment rates are at record high. And the ECB's new forecast shows that in the outer year, 2028, both the target, headline inflation is 2% and core inflation is 2%. So they are, as Christine Lagarde says, in a pretty good place. So for you to begin to publicly speculate in, is the next, rate change going to be a hike or another cut? I don't think that's particularly clever because I don't think they're going to do anything for probably all of 2026.
Hmm. Well, I don't want to hear that. I like it when central banks do things, but just
I,
kidding,
I mean,
sort of.
if you're growing at potential, you're at your inflation target, employment is record high. I mean, yeah, I suppose you could grow above potential, yes, but they're in a good place. That's the bottom line.
So, just in terms of the numbers you've seen, though, the recent reports from Europe, let me give you a list. Not super favorable. The S&P PMIs that were improving backed off in December. German data from the IFO and on consumer climate from GfK have been weak. Belgian National Bank survey reported weaker consumer confidence and strangely rising inflation expectations. UK isn't exactly Europe, but they're also dealing with some weak numbers. So is that just sort of the ups and downs? Is that any sign that maybe they're going to have to watch more closely to getting a little easier rather than holding steady or getting tighter?
Look, I think that before this meeting, before the new forecast, the September forecast showed that they were looking at 1.7% in 2026. That has now been revised up to 1.9, so essentially their target. And we know that that there is a sizable, very sizable, in fact, German fiscal stimulus coming online. We also know, or we don't know, but I think we should assume that trade friction with the United States is, if not contained, then the probability that we're going to have a dramatic increase in tariffs, irrespective, of course, of what happens on IEPA and other things domestically in the US, I think is quite small. So, I think Europe has problems. We can talk for a long time about the situation in France. We can talk about a negative trade shock that is affecting all the export economies from China, noticeably Germany. But at the same time, as I said, Europe's biggest economy, Germany, is about to launch a very large fiscal stimulus. You do have ongoing fiscal stimulus in most of Northern Europe from defense expenditures. And the labor market remains very, very strong. And real wages are growing. Savings rates remain high, but I think they will remain high, unfortunately, as long as the war is going on. It is kind of a precautionary saving, if you like, element to it. But overall, we can say, well, the situation ain't great, but it's not so bad either. And Europe is not a tiger economy. If you're growing at 1.5 with close to full employment, it's not so bad. And it's not going to get a lot better either.
Okay, well, so not so bad. Not expected to get better. And of course, the war across Europe, and there's many questions around that. Some good, like more defense spending, others like what's going to happen next. So in terms of Christine Lagarde and her team, her fellow policymakers, then are they kind of like you, like confident enough, the numbers are good enough that we, can at least stay where we are? And are they also just a little bit concerned that, gee, what if things don't stay so good? That it's better just to say we're not leaning in either direction. We're watching what happens next. We're watching the data and waiting to see if what you said comes true. Maybe they're probably, but going kind of meeting by meeting, right? Oh, we probably won't do anything in 2026, but it's best just to sit here and watch and don't take a big position that would make people say, Christine Lagarde has opened the door to a possible. Actually,
Yeah.
Isabel
Oh,
Schnabel has certainly
as I
opened the door to rate hikes next year.
They just published a macro forecast that is
Yep.
literally at the bullseye, kind of what you want. So for
Yeah.
them to say, "Oh, we're going to lean one way or the other," is kind of like saying they don't believe their own forecast. And if there's one thing
Yeah.
about the ECB is they believe very strongly in their forecasting framework. So it's not, in my opinion, surprising that they're not leaning one way or the other. And there might be individual members of the governing council or the executive board who does that. We heard Isabel Schnabel a week or two ago saying, well, she was sort of leaning towards the first change will be a hike. Other members of the governing council says the opposite. But as I said, bottom line, the president, and I think consensus on the governing board is, you know what, we're just going to wait and see what happens.
So in other words, it would take some kind of big shift or you know what I mean? It would take something that would upset that view that the consensus has before they would figure that they can
Yeah.
do more
I mean,
than, yeah.
I basically
Okay.
think you significant new information. And for me, at least, and this is actually, I think, quite important because we tend to think of the war as, overwhelmingly kind of all about defense expenditure and what is the stimulus, what is the fiscal multiplier of that, and all these kind of things. But the reality is, as I mentioned earlier, I think that a possible, if you like, satisfactory end to the war for Ukraine. Now, we can spend a lot of time about debating what that might look like. But if that happens, I think the euro area is going to go through a very significant positive confidence shock. And that matters a lot, in my opinion, because savings rates are as high as they are. So if you just had a reversal to the long-term average, you're looking at a decline in the savings rate of easily 2 percentage points of GDP. That certainly, to me, would suggest that in the, following again, successful from the perspective of Ukraine, peace settlement or end to the war, could
Okay.
associated in the next 4 to 6 quarters by significant outperformance of the euro area economy.
Well, I'm so glad you moved over to that because it's been this is one of those things I think for a lot of people it's so important. Obviously, it And every time I read news about Europe and even the ECB, this is some, so you're reading all this very closely, and kind of feeling the importance of it, right? In so many ways. Let me just ask you this. The EU just agreed to an EU-backed infusion of funds, if I'm not mistaken, 105 billion equivalent in US dollars for Ukraine. Europe didn't use the Russian assets that are frozen as collateral. Was this the right call?
Um, I would personally have preferred they use the Russian assets as explicit collateral. They didn't quite do that, but they didn't do the opposite either. It was kind of a typically EU sort of compromise because what they did was they had originally proposed to take the existing cash balances from the frozen Russian assets and basically just take the cash and quote unquote transfer it to Ukraine. Well, they didn't do that. What they did instead was they said, well, for a whole host of reasons that we can talk about if you like, we don't want to take the cash explicitly. So we, the EU, are going to issue 105 or so billion dollars in new common European debt, Eurobonds, and we're going to give those to Ukraine as an interest-free loan. But, and this is the key part, that loan is only, Ukraine only has to repay that loan if Russia, or when, or if, Russia pays Ukraine war reparations. But if Russia does not do that, the EU retains the right to actually be repaid with the immobilized or frozen Russian assets. So
Hmm.
it is not the case that they are just issuing quote unquote standard Eurobonds. They're not. The link, at least in a political sense, is still there to the underlying Russian assets. But it is not the original straightforward, if you like, collateral
Okay.
model that they proposed.
To what extent has Russians kind of scared off countries from getting his hands on its assets? Belgium, particularly wary, but not alone. Is the battle for these frozen assets, is it going to continue? Is it something that could be over?
Oh no, it's going to continue because the German Chancellor Merz and other, especially Northern and Eastern European countries, they wanted to use the Russian assets, and what this means, in my opinion, is because the EU is heading into its next long-term budget cycle. Basically, all the EU member states have to agree on the budget for the next 7 years for the EU during 2026. Well, the countries that usually pay most into that budget, Germany, the Nordics, the Dutch, and others, they all wanted the original reparation loan or the Russian assets as collateral. So what they are going to do, in my opinion, is they're going to say to the other member states that, look, if you want a bigger budget, if you want a budget that can also pay the now increased interest rate costs that will be borne by the budget because they're issuing, Eurobonds, well, we're not going to sanction a bigger budget unless the Russian assets are actually accessed in some form or another. So it is, in my opinion, far from over. These assets are going to be an integral part of these broader EU budget negotiations throughout the year 2026. Where we end up, I think, is difficult to say, but I personally would be surprised if we don't have a revisit of some form of direct accessing these assets. Because otherwise you're going to have a very, very tight EU budget. And the other member states are going to realize that many of the things that they like in that budget are going to be cut.
Hmm.
It's going to be a very, very fun, budget debate
Yeah.
we will have.
Is it is it just something the menace? How would I say? What's the right word without being too you know, I don't know what realistic, or maybe just don't put my view on this. But if Russia has severed most of its commercial ties with Europe, even as it, continues to attack Ukraine. And it still seems to have so much influence. Again, is it the obvious? Because it's a big country, it's at war with Ukraine, when Europe wonders what happens next. So you have to tread carefully, no matter how much in the right you may say yourself being as a country and as a region.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you're Belgium, you obviously, and you happen, because you are the home of Euroclear, the international security depository, and all that. You feel quite vulnerable. There's no doubt about that. And in fairness to the Belgian government, we know that Vladimir Putin is a murderous tyrant. I mean, we know that he has used radioactive isotopes and nerve gas, sarin nerve gas, to kill dissidents on British soil. So we know that he's capable of doing, truly reckless things. So, the personal security of members of the Belgian government, maybe even, you can see why the intimidation factor of a rogue nuclear power like Russia is not to be easily dismissed. But I will also say that there are also far more pecuniary reasons. The reality is also that Belgium, even though they claim that all the corporate tax that Euroclear is paying on the proceeds, on the revenues, the frozen assets, is given to Ukraine. A lot of people are somewhat skeptical about that. So there may very well be a desire of Belgium to hold on to these, you know,
Hmm.
assets in Euroclear, because they can make tax revenue off them. And certainly what they would like to do is to protect the Euroclear franchise, the international security depository franchise in Belgium. So they want to protect, even though in many ways, at least the Russian money there is obviously blood money in sort of an abstract sense. So there is also a commercial element to this. But I think it's
Yeah.
also worth noting that, Belgium is not the only country here. I mean, France kind of, in my opinion, played a little bit of a double role here, because the French didn't really lean one way or another, but the other country in Europe, apart from Belgium, that hosts by far the most of these Russian assets, nowhere near as many as Belgium, but
Okay.
somewhere between 16 to 18 billion, with most likely BNP Paribas, one of the other large French banks. It would be easier for the French government to just leave them there. Uh,
Okay.
have them. So France also did have an incentive to not support the original reparation.
So yeah. Okay. Well, so how do you think the war is going to play out? Is Russia going to get the land it wants? Will it get all of Donbass?
No, they won't. I mean, we're basically. I mean, the real both Ukraine and Russia are waging an unsustainable war. Russia is losing to this day about 1,000 men a day, either killed in action or gravely wounded in action. That is unlikely to be sustainable going forward. And it is true that Russia does make incremental gains along the front line, simply because they are willing to throw so many men at it. And Ukraine has a chronic shortage of manpower. So there's always going to be parts of the front line that is thinly staffed, if you like. But we also saw in recent days and weeks that the Ukrainians counterattacked in Kupiansk, which is one of the cities that Putin has specifically mentioned as an operational goal for the Russian army in 2025. Well, Vladimir Zelensky went there just a few days ago because the Ukrainian army retook the city. Just today, in fact, we heard from at Putin's annual big phone-in conference. He was lying about it. He claimed that this city was under full Russian control. Uh, so it's the reality is that the front line is fairly stagnant. Ukraine is not going to collapse. And Russia is not going to be able to break through, in my opinion. What that means is that the real, if you like, militarily important action is going to be on the strategic bombing part, where Russia has obviously been using hundreds of drones and missiles against Ukraine on a daily basis. They have
Yeah.
destroyed very large parts of the Ukrainian energy system. But Ukraine now has the advantage of knowing that, it's got a rich uncle in the EU that will pay for the war.
Yeah.
So it's not dependent on, it's obviously extraordinarily unpleasant and the human hardship endured by the, Ukrainian population. But in an economic sense, it matters less. Opposite for Russia.
Well,
Ukraine
okay.
are able increasingly to go after Russian refineries, energy facilities, other strategic targets. They are increasingly beginning to target directly Russian shadow fleet tankers. Can the Russian economy sustain that for another 2 years?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we don't
Yeah.
know, but
Well,
you know, it could.
wait. Well, and of course, you've worked very closely on these kinds of issues in your career as an economist, and also looking at uh, defense and all these kinds of things. So, um, I also want to ask you about this, and this is a little bit of a kind of a bigger question. Looks like the U.S. and Europe have very different plans. U.S. Apparently sees post-war Russia as an economic opportunity. Trump has his own plan for the frozen Russian central bank assets, but it would benefit the United States. It's looking for a speedy end of the war, while Europe has just funded the means for Ukraine to keep fighting. How do you put that into the picture, and what do you think how is that going to go forward?
Well, this was frankly one of the reasons why I preferred the original reparation loan. Because what that would have done is it would have removed any possibility that Russia could somehow tempt Trump with these assets, or perhaps more likely tempt the people around him that they might have a role in managing these assets going forward. So the fact that they are still there, even though, and I think this is important, the EU has essentially made it impossible to release them unless the EU wants it. So, and there is zero chance that the EU would ever release these funds to anything that might benefit, the Russian economy. Because the reality is that, quite unlike the Trump White House, the EU sees Russia as a long-term existential threat. And what that means is that, one, the EU is aggressively with Ukraine, of course, aiming to create an independent military deterrent of Russia. It simply does not trust NATO Article 5, the US security guarantee anymore. This will take some time. Which is why the EU keeps obviously bending over backwards to engage with the Trump administration. But what it does mean is that the EU's strategic long-term goal is a Russia as economically weak as possible, because that would reduce Russia's military potential and thereby making the EU's independent military deterrent more credible. We saw that a couple of weeks ago when the EU ultimately agreed to phase out all fossil fuel imports from Russia no later than mid or late third, fourth quarter 2027. That includes LNG. It certainly means that all the ideas, these insane ideas, in my opinion, that somehow the Nord Stream 2 pipeline should be reopened and all these things, it will never happen. It is the EU's strategic interest to keep Russia as economically weak as possible. And this will mean, absolutely, that there is an ongoing conflict with the Trump administration about this, because the Russian government is very clever at dangling corrupt opportunities in front of the Trump administration, critical minerals or whatever it is. But the EU will always oppose it. And they certainly, under no circumstances, will release the immobilized funds to be helpful for that. They want these funds to go to either fighting the war in Ukraine or the reconstruction of the war in Ukraine. And they have the power to ensure that.
So, this the Trump administration has said in many ways less in common with Europe than it used to. This is very recently, the new national strategy, et cetera. And by comparison, by contrast, some people say, well, gee, really, U.S. doesn't have all that much in common with Russia either. But is this just some sort of bargaining strategy, do you think, from the Trump side over to push on this whole how the decisions are made about Ukraine, how the decisions are made about how U.S. defense monies will or won't be spent? Do you think it's going to last beyond the Trump presidency? Is it true in a way, or is it just kind of an illusion, a Trump illusion?
Yeah, I think if Vice President Vance, who I think more than anybody embodies the arguments made and the spirit of the new national security strategy, if he's the next president, then it very certainly continues. But on the other hand, if you look at the recently passed, implemented National Defense Authorization Act, that act has very different priorities. It actually has not much, but some earmarked funding for U.S. military activities aimed explicitly at securing, NATO borders with Russia. So it fundamentally, is very different, highlighting that there is in the current Congress certainly a strong majority that is very much at odds with the national security strategy. And therefore, we will have to see what happens. But is it just a Trump fantasy? No, I think it is something that, a particular strain of the Republican Party believes very strongly in.
So what's going to happen? So we've sort of touched on this. Will Ukraine become an integrated part of Europe, a NATO member, a member of the EU? And how much internal reform in Ukraine could it take to maybe help get over those hurdles?
No, I mean, I am convinced that Ukraine will become a member of the EU for the simple reason that the EU needs Ukraine as part of its military deterrent of Russia. And what that means, it needs an economically successful Ukraine, which it can only have if it becomes a full member.
So tying it back to the European Central Bank, how important is it? Central bankers don't like to talk about these things when they're having policy meetings, et cetera. But what do you see there? What do you see on Christine Lagarde's mind on her team?
No, I mean, they obviously have to. This is one of the reasons why I think they are completely uncommittal, because they have no direct input on the war. And, it is very uncertain what will happen. But I think I like to think that they share my belief that if there was to be a satisfactory end to the war for Ukraine, it would be a very significant upward, positive confidence shot for Europe.
So from the European Central Bank being data dependent to the potential for a European peace dividend, Jacob, you've given us many possibilities to consider as 2025 draws to a close and a new year of possibilities lies ahead. I want to thank you again. Jacob Funk Kirkegaard is a non-resident senior fellow with the Peterson Institute for International Economics based in Washington, D.C. and a resident senior fellow with Bruegel, an economics think tank that's based in Brussels. He has also worked at the German Marshall Fund and with the Danish Ministry of Defense, and is a graduate of the Danish Army's Special School of Intelligence and Linguistics with the rank of First Lieutenant. I'm Kathleen Hays. Thank you for joining. This is Central Bank Central.